what we've sought to address in the joint
that's
instrument.
Very helpful. John Whittingdale.
Can I just pursue this theme very slightly further? The Attorney General's final paragraph essentially says that unless you can show breach of faith, rather than simply intractable differences, nothing has changed and the UK has no intentionally lawful means of exiting the protocol arrangements save by agreement. And when it comes to whether or not the difference is due to actual breach of faith or is simply intractable differences, that isn't really a question of fact. It's a question of opinion as to whether what is in the mind of the people undertaking the negotiations. So what confidence can we have that actually breach of faith stands any chance of being upheld if the EU simply turn around and say, no, we're trying to find a solution, we just don't believe that what you're suggesting works? That becomes an intractable difference.
Yeah, so what you quite rightly draw out is a distinction between whether there has been bad faith or whether both sides are still negotiating in good faith but have not got to the outcome.
Oh, no, intractable differences means you've stopped negotiating. It means there are intractable differences. That doesn't necessarily mean bad faith.
Well, you can have a situation where both sides are still negotiating in good faith, and that's why the way out of that is through the arrangements, and that's what it says. But the central question that came through the debates we had in the Chamber was this sense that the EU were going to act not in good faith to reach an agreement with the United Kingdom. The charge that many colleagues in the House had was the opposite, was that the EU were going to act in bad faith, and that the backstop was this vehicle to distort the negotiations and trap the UK. Now, if you trap the UK, you are de facto acting in bad faith. You are trying to distort the talks for negotiating advantage. That's
but you have to
the
prove
concern.
Bad faith. And if the EU aren't going to say, actually, we're never going to agree to anything you come forward with, because that would be bad faith. But if the EU say, look, we'd love to find a solution, we simply don't agree with you about the viability of the one you're proposing, that is an intractable difference, and it means we can't leave.
Which is why, and I referred to it, and it's paragraph 9 of the Attorney's advice, where he addresses the fact that if de facto the relationship has become permanent, then by its nature it is not temporary. Now, if both sides, one's got to, I think it's worth taking a step back, both sides have given a commitment to put a future economic partnership in place by the end of 2020. The question then is, at what point does that no longer become temporary as you go past that? Now, as I say, the aim is not to go into the backstop. That is what the work stream, which I did with a number of colleagues in the House, in terms of the alternative arrangements, and that's where we've made significant progress with a clear time frame and a commitment from the EU on that. The question, though, is beyond what both sides have agreed, at what point would it become de facto permanent? And at that point, to what extent does that mean bad faith is occurring? Now, if both sides are negotiating in good faith, then of course that negotiation will continue.
I'm afraid, I don't want to pursue it. All I would say to you, Secretary of State, is that the conclusion of the Attorney General's conclusions, which is the last paragraph of his letter, reads very much as if nothing actually has changed. And obviously I'm not a lawyer, I'm waiting for advice from my colleagues who are lawyers, but that final paragraph is pretty terminal.
Well, it's a long time since I was a lawyer, and I defer to the Attorney General, who is a far better lawyer. But I don't accept that because, as I say, one's got to look at this as a package, not in isolation. And I accept the point that if both sides are negotiating in good faith, that is what the final paragraph is referring to, and therefore there will need to be an arrangement. The central political concern that was raised during the first meaningful vote was that the risk was that the EU wouldn't enter into negotiations in good faith. The concern was that they would use it as a trap. And the point there is there has been a strengthening, and the Attorney's advice recognises it. And with respect, we can't cherry pick and say, well, he says there isn't a reduction of risk and therefore that is binding, but in 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs earlier, where he says there is a change to the legal risk, we're going to skirt over that. And I think, it's important one takes that at the whole. Also, if I may say, it's worth referencing back to his earlier advice of the 13th of November, where he said, actually, ultimately, these are questions of a balance of risk, and that politically, it will be in the interests of both sides. Now, that didn't persuade the House, and that is why we've sought to address the particular concern that the House had about this issue of bad faith. Now, it doesn't go as far as you would like, Mr. Whittingdale, Dale said that. But it does allow for this issue of bad faith and the UK being trapped. And that is the issue that politically kept coming up in the Chamber.
Okay, Jonathan Ginobili. Thank you.
Well, actually, Chairman, I was just going to look at what John Whittingdale's just said. I mean, John asked in the context of the agreement overall, and bad faith does apply to the agreement overall. The Secretary of State kept referring to alternative arrangements, presumably because that is an issue of significant concern to certain members of Parliament. And the alternative arrangement section, I think I'm right in saying, the need to work towards them is not in the binding section. And therefore, specifically on alternative arrangements, the question arises is what level of inaction in working towards getting those alternative arrangements would constitute bad faith. And I don't think the Secretary of State has actually nailed that answer.
Okay, well, if I may just try and help on that. So the joint instrument is legally binding text, and that does set out the arrangements in terms of alternative arrangements. So it does put that onto a legal footing, and that is something, therefore, that any arbitration panel would need to look at. So there is legal force to the timescale commitment on alternative arrangements. That is in the joint instrument.
No, but I was talking, Chairman, more specifically about the need to work towards getting those alternative arrangements. At what point would bad faith apply?
Sorry, say again.
At what point would bad faith be arguable in the context of not working towards the alternative arrangement?
Well, I think that's addressed in the AG's advice. So where he says where there's a pattern of unjustified delay, that would be the issue. And there is a clear, paragraph 7 to 11 of the joint instrument sets out a process whereby, in essence, momentum needs to be put into the alternative arrangements, and that this is legal text. So those paragraphs 7 to 11 of the joint instrument are legal text, and it makes time very much of the essence. So basically what you have there is something that has legal force, that the arbitrator would need to consider, and that it sets out that alternative arrangements which supersede the protocol in whole or part are not required to replicate its provisions in any respect. So one of the discussions we've had is around to what extent the alternative arrangements would be constrained because of the derogations required for the single market and the protection of the single market. And again, what this is saying is that there must be flexibility on both sides to look at how that technology is applied. But this, in the joint instrument, does have legal force.
Okay.